Everyone knew how much my family doted on the daughter they had just found again after she'd been missing for 10 years. If she so much as frowned, my parents were ready to lift the whole city of Beijing and lay it at her feet. But those same parents, who claimed to love me so dearly, abandoned me 3 times for the adopted daughter who only happened to look like me. The first time was when I told them the truth about my disappearance. My parents didn't kick out the imposter who had stolen my place for all those years. The day I ran away from home, they practically mobilized the entire city's network to look for me. They said, "Amelia, it was our fault. We didn't consider your feelings. We promise, this won't happen again." Looking at their graying hair, my heart softened. The second time was when the adopted daughter stole my childhood fiancé, my childhood sweetheart. My parents explained awkwardly. "Amelia, after you went missing, she stayed by our side. Without her, we wouldn't have made it through those dark days. And when Pablo's family brought up the engagement, we had no choice but to present her instead." My mother hugged me and comforted me. "Don't worry, Amelia. I promise, after we're gone, all the family assets will be yours. She won't get a single penny." And once again, I believed them. The third time was when she insisted on taking the jade bracelet I had worn for over 20 years to use as part of her dowry. That bracelet was the only thing my beloved grandmother left me, a token of her love. Yet my parents still forcibly took it from my hands. "What if I don't give it to her?" I asked, lifting my head. My parents only frowned. "Amelia, stop being difficult. She's getting married soon. Once she's married off, everything will go back to how it was." Back to how it was? Back to when I was their precious only daughter? Back to the nights they held me on the balcony counting stars just to coax me to sleep? Do they even remember those days? I didn't say any of that out loud. In the end, I just nodded wearily. Okay. What they didn't know was, I was about to emigrate. Once my plane touched down, we would be strangers from that day on. Chapter 1. Dad. Mom. It's almost time. We shouldn't delay any longer, Helen urged. My parents didn't even listen to my response. They instinctively followed Helen outside. I looked up. Helen was dressed in a traditional Chinese wedding gown, her face beaming with smug satisfaction. At her words, my parents immediately snapped out of any other thoughts, replacing them with joyful expressions as they rushed out to welcome the guests. As she left the room, Helen shoulder-checked me hard. Caught off guard, I fell to the floor. My hands scraped against the floorboards, and blood began to bead on the surface. "Dad, Mom," I called out. My father didn't even turn around. My mother gave me a complicated look and said, "Today is Helen's wedding day. Don't make a scene." I sat on the floor, trying to laugh, but the sound that came out was worse than crying. Looking around at the grand decorations of the old ancestral home, my heart twisted painfully. They brought Helen here to be married, in the most prestigious setting, just for appearances. This was their version of "it doesn't matter." In our family, only the eldest son and his direct descendants were allowed to marry in the ancestral home. Now, they gave this honor to Helen, and if they gave her this, how could they possibly cut her off completely after her wedding and go back to being one happy family with me? I wiped the blood off my arm carelessly and staggered outside. But downstairs, the chauffeur refused to drive me. "Miss Amelia, it's not that I don't want to help, but today is Miss Helen's wedding day. All the cars are being used for the guests. There really aren't any extras." He looked apologetic, but I understood the hidden message. The servants here knew who they should curry favor with. I wasn't important in this household anymore. Even the driver didn't want to bother with me. I didn't want to make things difficult, so I limped down the mountain on my own. The ancestral home was built halfway up the mountainside, secluded, peaceful, undisturbed, but impossible to get a taxi from. It was evening by the time I reached my destination, the immigration office. I collected the necessary immigration documents and returned once more to the ancestral home. By then, the evening banquet was in full swing. The air buzzed with excitement and laughter. I ignored it all and pushed the doors open. Standing in the doorway, I saw my parents leading Helen around to toast the guests. As soon as they saw me enter, the smiles froze on everyone's faces. Helen looked panic-stricken and turned helplessly toward our parents. The scene looked as if I were the villain here, someone truly evil. The room fell silent, all eyes on me. To break the awkwardness, Helen's groom, my former childhood sweetheart, Pablo, stepped up to speak. Thank you all for coming today to witness our wedding, and in this special moment, I want to give Helen a very special gift. As he spoke, a waiter brought out a document. This is an invitation from Master Nestor. From today onward, Helen will be his final disciple. At those words, my eyes turned red. Master Nestor, he's one of the top-ranked Go players in the country. He hadn't accepted a student in years. How did Pablo even manage this? But Pablo quickly answered that question himself. Master Nestor heard that you won the Donglan Cup at such a young age, and he was intrigued. He agreed to take you on as his student. So while this is presented as a gift from me, it's truly a result of your own talent. I merely facilitated the connection. Pablo kept talking, but I couldn't hear him anymore. I was staring in disbelief at my parents. The champion of the Donglan Cup was me. When did it become Helen's? Sensing my stare, both my parents lowered their heads. I was furious, ready to step forward and expose the truth. But my parents stopped me instantly. You've got so many trophies already. What's the harm in giving Helen just one? But this one wasn't just any trophy. The Donglan Cup was the most prestigious award I had ever won. It qualified me for the professional league for even greater accolades. But suddenly, I calmed down. That's right. I'm leaving. There's no point fighting for this trophy anymore. I told myself, let it go. Consider it a way to repay my parents for raising me. They had already given everything else to Helen. What difference did one more trophy make? Chapter 2. In the end, I couldn't even remember how I got back to my room. I just knew I didn't attend the second half of Helen's banquet. The next morning, my parents stood by my bed, their faces filled with guilt. As soon as I opened my eyes, my mother gently placed a hand on my forehead. We know you're hurting, Amelia. Don't be sad, okay? Now that Helen is married, you're our only daughter. We promise, we'll never let you feel neglected again. I calmly pushed her hand away. I'd heard these promises too many times over the years. Being lied to again and again, it wears you down. I no longer had the strength to believe. Seeing my flat response, their smiles froze, as if they suddenly remembered all the times they'd broken their word. Their faces turned awkward. At last, my mom cautiously broke the silence. Amelia, didn't you always want us to take a family trip to the Maldives? Pack your bags. We'll go today, okay? I wanted to say there was no need, but when I saw the plea in her eyes, I sighed. Once again, I gave in. But just as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw Helen, dressed up, sitting at the table enjoying breakfast. Before I could say a word, she spoke first. Mom, Dad, are you going to the Maldives with Amelia? That's so nice. I've never been to the Maldives with you two. Can I come along? I didn't even get a chance to respond before my parents frowned. We already promised Amelia it would just be the three of us this time. Helen, maybe next time. Helen pouted. But I really want to go with you this time. I curled my lips. I already knew the outcome. Sure enough, the moment Helen started to act cute, my parents gave in. All right then, but you have to promise not to upset Amelia, okay? In the car, I watched as Helen bounced happily beside my mother, holding onto her arm. Helen, be careful, don't trip. My mom's eyes were filled with affection, but when I used to be that energetic, all she said was, Amelia, you really lack discipline. Those words still stabbed like knives. I closed the car door softly. Since Helen was joining, I knew my parents wouldn't ride with me. It was always the same, the three of them in one car, and me in another. When we got to the beach, I quietly changed and prepared to go into the water. The very people who had once taught me to swim were now fussing over someone else. Helen, the water might be cold. Why don't you wait a bit before going in? I'm fine, she replied. Then she glanced at me and smiled. Besides, Amelia's here. She'll protect me, won't you? Amelia? Before I could reply, she slipped into the water like a fish. Seeing this, my parents had no choice but to turn to me. Amelia, make sure to keep an eye on Helen. She's not a strong swimmer. I didn't say anything. I just swam farther out. But I hadn't gone more than 2 meters when a head suddenly popped up behind me. Helen. I didn't even notice her following me. Something felt wrong. Amelia, she called out. I turned to face her and saw a triumphant smirk on her face. Who do you think Mom and Dad would save first if we both started drowning? Before I could reply, she grabbed my arm and yanked. Off balance. I sank. I tried to regain control, but Helen dove under and latched onto my ankle. Dad! Mom! Help! I shouted desperately before I was completely submerged. Helen began screaming too, pretending to drown. Mom! Dad! Helen! Helen! My parents dove into the water, panic written all over their faces. But not once, not even once, did they call my name. Before I blacked out, I caught a glimpse of them swimming back with Helen in their arms, without looking back. In that blurred moment, I remembered something they used to tell me. Amelia, you are our most precious jewel, the very core of our lives. But now I finally knew just how little that meant. Chapter 3. The moment I opened my eyes, I began coughing violently, as if I were being torn apart from the inside. My mother rushed over and started patting my back. I kept coughing until tears began to fall. Seeing this, my parents hugged me tightly, their voices full of concern. Amelia, are you okay? Does it hurt somewhere? I shook my head in silence. In my mind, I could still see their cold, unhesitating backs as they swam away with Helen. My heart ached so much, the pain in my body felt insignificant by comparison. Just then, my mother spoke softly, almost cautiously. Amelia, now that you're awake, would you be willing to get tested for a bone marrow match? The doctor said Helen has acute leukemia and needs a transplant as soon as possible. Your father and I aren't matches. Could you give it a try? For a moment, it felt like I hadn't been rescued at all, like I had drowned in the ocean and was now just dreaming. But the sting in my palms reminded me that I was still alive, that this nightmare was real. So, if I'm a match, you want me to donate my bone marrow to her? My voice was hoarse, like a broken bellows, every word painful to utter. My parents frowned. Amelia, Helen is our daughter too. Can't you just help her, for our sake? I don't know if it was the wind, or just my own body trembling, but suddenly, I felt so cold. I stared at them, unblinking, trying to find even a hint of love or sympathy on their faces. There was none, only urgency and a subtle trace of impatience. At that moment, the doctor walked in and spoke casually, as if he hadn't heard a word of what came before. Well, have you found a match yet? The young lady doesn't have much time left. At those words, my parents immediately pulled me from the bed, practically forcing me toward the testing room. The needle piercing my arm felt like a blade driving into my chest. The pain was sharp and overwhelming. I couldn't help but shiver. My face turned pale as paper, but neither of them noticed. They were too busy staring at the blood flowing into the tube, nodding in relief. That's fine. Let's call it repaying the debt of being raised. I closed my eyes in disappointment, just in time to see my parents following the nurse out. Faces filled with excitement. Faintly, I could hear them speaking. Do you think we're being too unfair to Amelia? My father tried to comfort her. It's not like she's going anywhere. We'll make it up to her eventually. I stumbled back to my room alone. On the way, I passed another ward, and there was Helen, the supposedly dying girl, sitting up confidently and talking on the phone with a smug grin. It's nothing. I faked it. I just wanted to test if Mom and Dad loved me more than Amelia. Of course I won. That was obvious. I couldn't listen any longer. Yes, in their eyes, I would never compare to Helen, even if it was a lie. Even if she was manipulating them, my parents still wouldn't risk even the slightest chance that it might be true. So what did that make me? They were the ones who lost me all those years ago. They were the ones who cried and grieved. And now, they were the ones who couldn't care less about me. Fortunately, I didn't need them anymore. Blood meant nothing when love was absent. Why should I keep trying? Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from the immigration office. Miss Amelia, your immigration paperwork is complete. I wiped away my tears. I didn't go back to my room. I went straight downstairs and hailed a cab to the airport. Right before boarding, I sent my parents one final message. I'm leaving. I won't fight for the place in your hearts anymore. A moment later, my father's panicked voice came through the phone. Amelia, where are you going? Chapter 4. I didn't answer. I simply hung up the phone. I had already said what needed to be said, countless times. Since they didn't listen before, There was no point in repeating myself now. When Helen heard I had left, the smile in her eyes was practically overflowing, though she still tried to feign concern. Why did sister leave without saying anything? But at that moment, my parents didn't have the energy to worry about her. Just minutes earlier, the doctor had told them something shocking. Helen's acute leukemia had been a misdiagnosis. Upon hearing this, an uneasy feeling rose in their hearts. They suddenly realized that things might not be as they'd imagined. Since Helen was fine, they rushed home, hoping I had come back. But when they opened the door, the entire house was empty, and when they entered my room, it was even more barren. My bedroom was astonishingly simple: a bed, a desk, and a bookshelf. That was it. It was only then that they seemed to remember. When I first returned home, my room had already been taken over by Helen. They didn't have the heart to ask her to move out, so I was placed in the guest room. They always promised they'd redecorate a new room just for me. But 7 years passed, and that room never came. The bookshelf was filled with densely packed trophies, and beneath them lay a diary. My mother picked it up, her hands trembling. Mom and Dad said they'd celebrate my birthday with me again, but they didn't come. They went shopping with Helen. I don't understand. If they don't love me, why did they even bring me back? They keep saying they owe me, but what's the point? It's always, wait a little longer. They promise to make it up to me, but I don't want compensation. I just want Mom and Dad. I don't want them anymore. They don't believe me. They don't need me. Reading that last sentence made their hearts tremble. It was then that they realized where I might have gone. With shaking hands, Dad called the immigration office. As expected, the news came. I had already left the country. With a loud thud, Dad's phone fell to the ground. Panic filled Mom's face. At that very moment, Pablo walked in, holding Helen by the shoulders. Helen, Amelia's finally gone. That illness trick of yours worked like a charm. So the leukemia had been fake all along. Thinking back to what they had witnessed at the hospital, their faces turned pale. Dad came down the stairs with a dark expression. Helen, what's going on? Helen was completely caught off guard. She hadn't expected them to be home. Fortunately for her, she still had her usual weapon, tears. They came instantly. I know I'm not your real daughter. I just wanted to test how much you loved me. Hearing that, Dad slammed his hand against the table in rage. Mom's eyes burned red with fury. Do you have any idea what you've done? Helen reverted to her usual act of helplessness. I just care about you both too much. But this time, no one answered. And most importantly, no one forgave her. Chapter 5. After that day, my dad hired a private investigator. He desperately wanted to know what exactly they had done to make me leave. But as the surveillance footage was presented to them one by one, they fell silent. Helen deliberately bumped into me, and they turned a blind eye. At the beach, the only person they worried about was Helen. Even when I drowned, it was Helen who pulled me down. But afterward, all they could see in their eyes was still just Helen. Now, looking back at it all, my parents' eyes were filled with pain and panic. They were in a rush to absolve themselves, eager to shift all the blame onto Helen. They called her into the living room, threw down screenshots from the footage, and demanded to know if she had lied on purpose. At this point, Helen didn't even bother pretending anymore. You really love her? It's just guilt. Every time you favor her, you make excuses. Dad was furious. He ordered the bodyguards to throw her luggage out the door. Mom tore up the adoption papers on the spot. How could I have let Amelia leave because of a monster like you? Helen was tossed out to the doorstep, still trying to act delicate. But Mom and Dad no longer believed her. Now, all they wanted was to find me and make up for the 10 years they owed, even if it meant crossing oceans. When the plane landed in Vancouver, it was raining. I stepped out of the airport and chuckled softly. This time, I truly had nothing to do with that home anymore. The small apartment I rented was above an art gallery. The landlady spoke Chinese while helping me carry boxes. She asked, "Miss, your parents didn't come with you?" I smiled. They're busy. By day, I worked at the gallery. At night, I curled up on my small bed and painted. On weekends, I'd go grocery shopping. One time, I passed a Go Club with a poster of Master Nestor in the window. I stood in front of it for a long time. until the shopkeeper came out and asked, "Want to come in and take a look?" I shook my head, remembering what Pablo once said, "Amelia, you're so talented at Go, you'll definitely be a master one day." I tried to smile, but no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't. My thoughts drifted, and my eyes wandered. I saw a couple feeding pigeons with their daughter. The little girl tripped, and her dad quickly scooped her up and rubbed her scraped knee, while the mother gently blew on the wound. It was exactly like how my parents treated me before I went missing. For some reason, I suddenly remembered my 10th birthday. They had promised to take me out for pizza. But in the end, they spent the day helping Helen pick out a piano. That evening, the gallery owner called. "Amelia, we have an exhibition tomorrow. Can you come early to help set up?" I agreed, hung up, and pulled the diary from beneath my pillow. I flipped to a new page and wrote, "Today, I began a new life." At 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a call from my dad. I stared at the screen until the battery died. Outside, rain poured down. I remembered the stormy night I went missing at 12. How my parents searched for me for 3 days and 3 nights. But when I finally returned, they were no longer the parents I remembered. In the morning, on my way to work, I passed a vendor selling roasted chestnuts. I bought a bag and ate them while walking. They were piping hot, so hot they made my eyes sting. Suddenly, I remembered how Helen had once thrown my chestnuts into the trash, and my parents, watching it happen, had only told me not to eat chestnuts in front of her again. At the gallery that day, the owner pointed to a painting of dark clouds. "This one sells best." The customer said it looks like a weight on their heart. I said nothing. I quietly wiped the frame and thought, if only they knew, there's a whole mountain on mine. On the way home, I passed a convenience store. The news on TV was broadcasting a headline about my family. Adopted daughter weds in splendor. Biological daughter lives abroad in obscurity. I turned off the TV, bought a can of beer, and sat on the curb to drink it before going home. Before bed, I charged my phone. When it powered back on, dozens of unread messages popped up, all from my parents. "Amelia, where are you? Please come home." I didn't open a single one. I held down the power button, shut the phone off again, and shoved it into the farthest corner of my drawer. That night, I had a dream. In it, the ginkgo tree at the old house bloomed. I stood under it, waiting for my parents, but it was Helen who came out wearing my dress. Behind her, my parents said, "Helen looks so beautiful today." I tried to call out to them, but no sound came, until my tears soaked through the pillow. Chapter 6. Winter comes early in Vancouver. While wiping the gallery windows, I saw 2 elderly people standing across the street. The man wore a black coat, and the woman had a camel-colored scarf. Both were styles I knew too well. My hand trembled. The rag slipped into the bucket, soaking my sleeve. The next morning, they were still there. The man was coughing violently, and the woman kept patting his back. I lowered my head and pretended to study the paintings, but my ears strained toward the front door. "Amelia, yeah, those 2 old people outside keep looking at you," the intern said. I gave a quiet and continued wiping a picture frame, but I accidentally hung the "do not touch" sign upside down. By the 3rd day, it was the weekend. I deliberately stayed late, hoping to avoid them, but as I passed through the alley, I suddenly heard ragged breathing. Around the corner, my father was squatting on the ground, hand pressed to his chest, face pale as paper. My mother was rummaging through her canvas bag for a water bottle. The plastic clinked loudly in her shaking hands. I froze, a lump rising in my throat, watching her pass the bottle to him. Then she turned into a convenience store lit with warm yellow lights. 15 minutes later, the ambulance came. I rushed out. My father was already on the stretcher. My mother held his hand, repeating, "Don't be afraid." When she saw me, her eyes lit up. "Amelia." I turned away, but I followed the ambulance to the hospital. The smell of disinfectant made me dizzy. At the end of the hallway, my mother pulled a red velvet box from her canvas bag. Inside, my grandmother's jade bracelet glowed with a soft warmth. "We were so foolish back then." She gently rubbed the bracelet. "I had someone redeem this from the auction house. If your grandmother knew. Her voice faded. Then she suddenly grabbed my hand. Please, give us a chance to make it right. I stared at the fine crack in the jade, but I pulled my hand away. If I hadn't left, would you have ever seen through Helen's act? Did you love me? Or just the shadow of your missing daughter? She opened her mouth but said nothing. Tears welled up in her eyes. After my father was discharged, they rented an apartment across from the gallery. Every morning, I could see him at the window with a book titled Practical English Conversation, his reading glasses always slipping down his nose, his finger tracing the lines. Once, I passed by a cafe. Through the glass, I saw my mom in an apron, learning latte art from the barista. On the table was a thick book, The Complete Nutritionist's Cookbook. At the end of the month, the gallery held an exhibition. We were short-staffed. After hearing about it, my mother came the next day with rubber gloves, kneeling to scrub paint stains from the floor tiles. My father wore white gloves, carefully carrying picture frames like they were treasure. When visitors asked about the paintings, he answered in broken English, awkward pronunciation, but his eyes shone with sincerity. I didn't say thank you, but during lunch breaks, I started bringing 2 extra sandwiches and leaving them on the bench they sat on. My mom would always push the one with the most shrimp toward me. My dad busied himself drying off any condensation on the wrappers with napkins. One deep winter evening, I was reheating a rice ball at the convenience store when Helen's face suddenly appeared on the TV. She wore a prison uniform, her eyes vacant. Below her, sentenced to 3 years for fraud. The anchor read, "The adopted daughter fraud case has drawn public attention. The adoptive parents refused to provide legal aid and have donated the compensation to the Missing Children Fund." My phone buzzed. A message from Mom. "We've already given our statements to the police. The compensation has been donated." I stared at the screen for a long time, then replied, "That's what you should have done. Soon." She sent back a short mem. "No more." I put my phone away, took a bite of the rice ball. In the warmth of the rice, I suddenly tasted a bit of salt. I couldn't tell if it was the mayonnaise or my tears. Chapter 7. 3 springs later, my solo exhibition opened at the gallery. The theme was the light behind the clouds. In all 20 paintings, storm clouds were split by cracks of light, some golden, some silvery white. Visitors stood in front of the canvases whispering. Someone said, "It looks like hope breaking through." Another said, "Like the sun after a long rain." From the corner of the exhibition hall, I saw my parents sitting on folding chairs in the back row. Dad wore that same black coat, Mom a newly knitted gray scarf. Both of them were staring at the wall, eyes fixed on the paintings. Mom suddenly reached up to wipe her eyes, and Dad gently patted her back. Just like that year at the beach, when they comforted Helen. Only this time, their gaze stayed on the artwork, on the world I had woven with my brush. At the end of the exhibit, the crowd gradually thinned. I walked up to them and pulled 2 plane tickets from my canvas bag. "I'm going to an international Go tournament next month. If you'd like, you can come watch." Dad was stunned when he took the tickets. His fingertips trembled slightly. Mom looked up at me, her eyes filled with surprise and a cautious glimmer of hope. I turned and walked toward the gallery entrance. Sunlight filtered through the skylight, falling warmly across my back. Outside the glass doors, cherry blossoms drifted gently through the air. A pink petal landed on Dad's coat. Mom reached out to brush it away. Their shadows overlapped and stretched long in the sun. That night, back at my apartment, I opened the diary beneath my pillow. On the yellowing page, my handwriting from 7 years ago still remained. They always say they'll make it up to me, but all I ever wanted was Mom and Dad. My fingers traced the words. Then I picked up a pen and wrote a new line on the final page. That year, the ocean waves soaked my memories, but couldn't wash away the bonds of blood. It took them 3 years to learn how to love, and me 3 years to learn how to forgive. Maybe love is never absent. It just gets lost behind the clouds, wandering until it finds who it's meant to shine on. Outside, the Vancouver stars sparkled like scattered diamonds. I closed the journal and tucked it deep in my drawer, beside Grandma's jade bracelet, still warm with its gentle glow. I turned off my phone, pulled open the curtains. Night wind, tinged with the scent of cherry blossoms, swept in. In the distance, the church bell struck midnight. A new day was quietly breaking through the clouds. On the day of the Go tournament, Dad wore a freshly pressed suit, and Mom had on a red wool sweater she picked specially. They sat in the audience, watching as I placed stones across the board like flying sparks. I glanced up. They were frowning with concentration, nervous, maybe even more than I was. Seeing them, I suddenly remembered my first childhood tournament win at age 10. They had displayed my trophy in the living room's most prominent spot. But then Helen came. The trophy ended up in storage, covered in dust. Now, that dust had long since been wiped away by time. What remained were two faces flushed with excitement, and the light in their eyes. As they looked at me again, I won. The champion would represent our country in the next round. It was my opportunity. As we exited, Mom suddenly pointed at the sky. "Look! A rainbow!" I looked up. The post-rain sky had split open. A 7-colored arc stretched across it, just like the light in my paintings. Dad pulled out his phone to take a picture. Mom fussed with my hair, saying, "Get the rainbow and Amelia in the same shot." That night, under the starlight, I turned on my desk lamp and wrote one more sentence in my diary. The clouds will part, the sun will come, love may arrive late, but it never forgets to show up.